that Joseph Young built is now being demolished as we speak. So it's a sad day that this kind of thing is still going on. But I digress. We really want to delve into this hurricane topic because hurricane season is around the corner, and this is a lot of information in this. I have about 65 images to show you. So I am going to start this process of sharing the screen, which is a little different because I have to do it in presenter mode, and Zoom is a little difficult in the presenter mode for a PowerPoint, but I practiced it like a good presenter, and I will try to get this thing lined up so we can see it properly. Pay no attention to the notes on the side. Okay, so the big one, and it was called the big one for a very good reason, this storm or the Miami hurricane. A lot of people think about Fort Lauderdale and Hollywood when you talk about this hurricane, but it really, Miami was the biggest major metropolitan area of South Florida in 1926. And when this monster came around, it really struck Miami downtown, the core of Miami in downtown. And it didn't have a name because we weren't naming hurricanes in 1926. And it just kind of came out of nowhere and slammed into South Florida during the first building boom that the state had ever seen. And it was something that completely changed the landscape of South Florida during that time. There's a marker at the site of this was such a big hurricane. They have a historic marker about this hurricane at the site of the Weather Bureau office in downtown, where the Richard Gray was holding the station together while this storm was coming. They put this marker here in commemoration of the storm. The storm hits in 1926, obviously, and about that same time, you have the University of Miami was just opening up in 1926, and after this pivotal event in South Florida, they decided to take the nickname of the Hurricanes. And they also adopted the ibis as their mascot because the legend of the ibis is it is the first to leave an area when a hurricane's coming, and it's actually the first to return after a hurricane. So our major university is named after this very important event in our history. And a lot of people don't realize, we talk about the destruction of Southeast Florida. This thing was so big, by the time it got over to the west coast of Florida, like most hurricanes do, they either hit from the west or the east, and they travel across the state. It retained so much energy that in Moorhaven, the mud dikes around Lake Okeechobee gave way, and most of the deaths from this storm were in Moorhaven, where people drowned and got washed away. It then gets over to Sanibel and entirely inundates the entire island of Sanibel underwater. So the island of Sanibel was gone under the ocean, and when the tide finally receded, they said the stench of dead, decaying sea life was so much that they couldn't stay on the island. People actually had to leave because there was rotting fish everywhere, even in people's cars. So this thing was powerful and it was gigantic. And the reason it was is because it was a classic Cape Verde storm. We hear about this now because we have this 24-hour news cycle. The Cape Verde hurricanes at this time of year are the worst because they're born in a part of the Atlantic Ocean basin, the Caribbean basin, where it's very warm and the winds aren't real strong, and they have a lot of time to gain speed. And that's exactly what this thing did. And I was able to find the actual track of this storm, or thereabouts, because it's not exact because there was no satellites at the time. So this is the track that this storm took. And the interesting thing is it's missing all the islands. So our information was gleaned from the islands when there was a hurricane in the Caribbean, and they couldn't get a fix on this thing because it kept missing the islands. And it wasn't until it got close to Nassau that we realized it was close to us. It blew their instruments away and their communication. So we really had no idea what had happened to Nassau. And the next thing you know, it's at South Florida's door, so to speak. So that's the actual track of the hurricane. And then it survived and went all around the panhandle, similar to what we see today. They haven't changed much. This hurricane was 150 mile an hour winds. And really that's a guess, because when they put the weather office in downtown Miami, Unfortunately, they were building tall buildings around the weather office, and there were tall buildings around the wind meter. And so the wind meter wasn't getting the full force of the winds. It's quite possible that this hurricane, and judging by the damage that it left behind, was higher than 150-mile-an-hour winds. And that is actually a topic in the meteorological notes after the storm. They talked about how this wind meter was being blocked by buildings. Fatalities 371 to 539. It was the costliest storm when you converted it to today's dollars. I believe that's been broken because our hurricanes are getting stronger. And it was huge. This thing was about 370 miles total in diameter. Now that's not where the core wind speed were, but that's how much area it covered when it came over to South Florida. And it had a low barometric pressure, and there was just an article in the paper about how they're realizing low barometric pressure is actually worse than the wind speed, because if you have a storm with an extremely low barometric pressure, it causes a bigger storm surge. Like Katrina was a 3 when it hit Louisiana, New Orleans, and the storm surge was 23 feet. Charlie was a 5, and the storm surge was about 10 feet. So it's all about the barometric pressure. And usually those are larger storms with bigger eyes, which is what this thing was. And it was also, unfortunately for South Florida, a very slow mover. So it drug itself across Southeast Florida. And this poor guy was in charge when this hurricane came ashore. And this is Richard Gray. And he was doing his best to try to warn people that this thing could be coming. But unfortunately, like I spoke about early, there was no way of knowing exactly where this thing were. Ships were not going out in that area at the time. So they knew there was a storm out there, and they had posted possible storm warnings on September 17th, the day before the storm. And it wasn't until 11 o'clock at night. And the way they did this was they would get telegraph information at the Miami office. The Miami office would send that information to Washington, D.C. They would have to decipher everything, and then they would send it back down to Miami and tell Miami what to do. That's how archaic it was. So because of that, the hurricane warnings went out 11 p.m. The storm made landfall at 5 o'clock, between 5 and 6 o'clock that same morning. So it's 11 p.m. Saturday night. Everybody's out on the town having a good time, not really even knowing what's going on. And all of a sudden at 5 o'clock in the morning, this hurricane is on everybody. And there was very, very little warning to get ready. Not that anybody could get ready anyways, because everybody that was here in South Florida in 1926 had not been through a hurricane. Virginia Tenig's book, The History of Hollywood, says there wasn't a storm shutter in sight in South Florida in 1926. They were not building buildings to withstand anything like this. And now all of a sudden, without warning, literally, we were caught with our pants down. There's no other way to say it. And we learned a valuable lesson, but maybe not, because history does repeat itself. So this is the actual meteorological notes from right after the storm. The storm surge was 8 feet in downtown Miami. So if you stood in downtown, unless you were 8 feet tall, the water was over your head. The ocean completely inundated all of Miami Beach, Key Biscayne, all the Finger Islands. And if you stood in downtown Miami, there was no beach. The ocean went up to downtown Miami, and the Miami River completely flooded and went over its bank. So water really was the culprit and the storm surge, on top of the wind and the poor construction. It was really the perfect storm. Here's the landfall, 5:30 to 6:10 p.m. High tide was 6:30, the exact moment this huge low pressure dome is making its way, pushing. So what that does, as the tide's coming in, the low pressure is raising the water and also pushing it in even further to make this kind of disaster happen. And on top of everything else, it was a full moon. So it doesn't get any worse than that. And that's the reason that this was such a horrible experience. And I know we've all seen a lot of videos of hurricanes in action, but I mined a little video from Hurricane Dorian that just hit the Bahamas that was headed for South Florida, just so you could get like a 15-second window into what would happen again if we were in the path of something like that. So that's the next slide. So let me just try to see if I can play that. There it goes. It's going to play. So it's hard to imagine being in your home and looking out your window and seeing this. But this is what the people that were here in 1926 saw, and they weren't in very good buildings. I mean, that's why people left South Florida after this event, and they saw that and their house fell apart around them. They just left. Nobody wanted to live here and go through that hell again. And the other problem with the era that it hit in 1926, there really wasn't a lot of building here. So if you had a house in a neighborhood, chances are there was open space all around you. So on top of the fact that it wasn't maybe built well, the wind speed hitting your building had nothing to break it. So it was wide open. There really weren't a lot of trees either because we cut all the trees down. So basically you have a flat plain with nothing obstructing the wind. You're getting the full force of that 150, 180 mile an hour wind with nothing to protect you. Today, there's so much development. It's almost like a herd of cows. So if you're the cow in the middle, you know, you're not going to get affected so much. It's those outer buildings that are really going to get, it's kind of like a protected, but back in 1926, we did not have that. So that also made a problem. This is an illustration of what happened during the landfall. And you can see all of the blue area here is water. So, and all of this blue area, which is west of Bayshore Drive, is underwater. And you can see the Miami River had completely overflowed and everything was completely inundated. And in Hollywood, you know, we have a special problem because we are a very low elevation. So here is downtown Miami during the storm, and you can see all these palm trees. They're halfway up. Some of these palm trees could be 20, 30 feet tall, and they're completely inundated. So this is what happened in Hollywood. So during the storm, the ocean went all the way up, believe it or not, it's hard to digest, Dixie Highway. Hollywood is a very flat part of the coastal part of South Florida. It doesn't really have a lot of elevation change, and everything east of 14th Avenue in Hollywood, so that's not that far east of Federal Highway, was tidal when Joseph Young got here, which meant at high tide in 1926, that whole area had water under it. So the elevation of that area is like 0, 1, 2 maybe. So again, water was the biggest problem here. And we know from oral histories that the ocean did in fact go up to Dixie Highway, and Dixie Highway acted as a dam to prevent it from going any further because the railroad tracks are built on a bit of a hump. So it actually stopped the water from going further west, because it would have had it not been for the railroad tracks. Granted, it wasn't that deep, but it was water and there was seaweed, which blows my mind. And I want to point out the difference of the shoreline between today and 1926. So this is an aerial view of the Hollywood Beach Hotel as it looks today. You can see this is the end of the hotel here, okay? And then the water is all the way over here, what made this disaster worse for Hollywood was in 1926, here's the same hotel, here's that same wall I was talking about. There's no Broadwalk here. Grumpy Gary's is out here. So at the time of the storm hitting, the ocean was much closer to this building. And also there was gigantic sand dunes up and down the coast of Hollywood on the beach that were protectors of storms. This is a natural Florida beach dune. There were sea grapes and seagrass and all these things that made the dunes higher. And that's why we're trying to get back into dune beach plantings to start renourishing our dunes. What does Joseph Young do? Because of course nobody knows any better. He gets a water pumper and dumps the hose in the intercoastal and starts water jetting all the protective beach dunes level. So when he builds his promenade, you could see the ocean. You didn't want to walk down the Broadwalk and see these pesky dunes where you can't see the water. So that contributed to the disaster that we experienced, unfortunately. I want to just say something about this hotel, though. This hotel opens in 1925. The hurricane hits in 1926. This became a shelter for people on the beach. This hotel is made out of poured solid concrete. Even the interior hotel rooms are poured concrete. There's no wood, there's no drywall. It's literally a bunker. And to have 4-inch thick interior walls between rooms is pretty remarkable for something like this. And in fact, a lot of people on the beach during the height of this storm swam to this hotel to get in here to save their lives because buildings on the beaches were getting washed away. As a matter of fact, the water went into this hotel and sand was all the way up to the second floor of this hotel after the storm was over. This poor guy, Oscar T. Johnson's first day on the job, he comes in on the train on September 17th, and the storm hits September 18th at 5 a.m. in the morning, and he had no idea that this thing was coming. And he ends up staying at the hotel for about, obviously 20 years, and he told a very funny story on his retirement about that first crazy night when he was at the hotel, and he had to go downstairs and try to get the water off a $30,000 Oriental rug that was completely soaked with seaweed and salt water. And it was quite an introduction to South Florida, to say the least. Also, getting back to that Hollywood Beach Hotel, during the storm, when the beach was completely underwater, somebody's car disappeared and they could never find it. It was an Essex coupe. And years later, they had to clean out the grease trap of this hotel. And when they pulled off the concrete lid, they found the car in the grease trap. Apparently, the lid had floated off the grease trap. The car went into the grease trap, probably floating around too. And at the end of the storm, they put the grease trap concrete top on top, not realizing somebody's car was in fact in the grease trap. So that's how strong this storm was. So landfall, we talked about the landfall and how devastating that. The other thing I want to mention is eye wall, where was the eye? People ask me, where was the eye of the storm? Where exactly? So the monthly, the report, the official report from the Weather Service said the eye landed in downtown Miami and Perrine, and that there was a pronounced lull of about 30-35 minutes in downtown Miami, at which time that poor guy, Richard Gray, saw everybody out, you know, praying, thanking God they were alive, picking up stuff, trying to run around. And he was frantically trying to tell these people, this is not over. You need to find shelter. And unfortunately, they didn't know what he was saying. They didn't get back in. And just as fast as that lull came, it ended. And there's really no time. If you're out and about during the eye of a hurricane and you're not close to shelter, you're going to get blown away. And those people literally got blown away. So the interesting thing is, we have oral histories in the city of Hollywood's archives that talk about the eye. So people went out in Hollywood during the eye. And Tony Mickelson, Joan Mickelson's father, who was a surveyor for Joe Young, left the storm during the eye. So since there was no radar, there was no satellites, there was no way to track this thing, I really feel like the eye was bigger than they thought, and or maybe 2 eye walls, but there was, which means Hollywood for the worst of this storm, because the northern eye wall is always the worst place to be in one of these storms, and that's exactly where we were. So that's part of the reason that we got so much damage. So I would have to say that we probably did get an eye on Hollywood based on the eyewitness accounts that we do have documented in the research center at the History of Hollywood. Interestingly enough, if that disaster wasn't bad enough, 2 years later, almost to the day, within a few hours of the exact day of the Monster 26 storm, a Monster 1928 storm hits Jupiter, goes over to Lake Okeechobee, and thousands, 2,500 people drowned in the neighborhoods of Pahokee and Canal Point, because that was a bigger breach of the dike, and it was a wall of like 20 to 30 feet of water that literally, a tidal wave washed away the entire town. Many people weren't even found. They were just like gone forever. So we had 2 back-to-back disasters. I know this is about the big one, but this was equally as big, and it was almost the exact day, only 2 years later. So everybody talks about the storm creating the real estate collapse. That's really not true. This bubble was already deflating well before this storm hit. And in Hollywood alone, more than 100 salesmen and many secretaries and clerks of the young companies found business at a complete standstill. And by spring of 1926, many, many months before this storm hits, buyers were falling behind on their payments. So it was already starting, and then the hurricane was the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. And it's often stated that South Florida entered the Depression before the rest of the country because of this storm, and that is true. So now I want to start looking at what Hollywood looked like right before the storm hit, because it was in fact the biggest building boom that the state had ever seen, obviously, because there was nobody here really before 1920. So this is a view of Hollywood Beach before the storm. This is probably less than a year before this storm hits. And when I told you about all the land being open, this is what I'm talking about. The North and South Lake is just recently not even completed to be dredged yet. You can see this wide open area here. There's really nothing to stop the water, and you can see how low the elevation is here. And there's even like standing water over here because the ground is so low, and I believe they're still trying to build this land up. I also did a little quick search on the internet and found some very incredible footage of people promenading down our boardwalk in 1926, the exact day that this picture was taken, because you can see this guy in this little ladder with a camera. This was a publicity photo for, or video for Hollywood in 1926-25, and the Smithsonian got a hold of it and colorized it. And a lot of these videos, they're not our property. We don't own them. In the Hollywood Historical Society, they are online at the Smithsonian. If anybody goes to the Smithsonian, you can go in their archives and view these yourself, or the Smithsonian, you can find it online very easy. So here we are in 1926. These people don't know what's going to hit them. They are living life, loving South Florida. They found the dream, and they're all happy as can be. And I love that the Smithsonian did a lot of research to get the colorization of this black and white just perfect. You could see in the background, this is the Tangerine Tea Room. This is the Broadwalk. They are having what's called a baby parade. This Tangerine Tea Room, it got destroyed in the storm. Here's the little baby parade. Isn't it cute? A little bonnet there. I mean, who knew what was going to happen when everybody's, having a good time here? That was kind of out of place. So this is more publicity photos from the Wilsonian. This is our downtown area here. There's the Hollywood Bank and Trust. It actually was across the street before we built the building that we're tearing down today. That's where the octopus is, right there. The Hollywood Publishing Building. Then you can see the Parkview Hotel is right here. This is Joseph Young's administration. It turned into a morgue. Here is the Parkview Hotel. Here's the bathing casino, which was severely damaged in the storm. These are incredible images that I had never seen before. And there's Johnson Street and the Broadwalk. This is the Tangerine Tea Room. And look how close the water is to the Broadwalk. It is not that close now. Our shoreline is actually bigger today than it was back then because of all the beach renourishing that we have performed over the years. So that's what was going on in 1926, right before this storm hit. And there's the gigantic bathing casinos. There was 3 pools at the bathing casino, Olympic-sized swimming pool, 2 smaller pools. I believe there was like 600 or 800 dressing rooms in this thing. It was gigantic, and it was very severely damaged after the storm. It was undermined. This is damage after the storm. This is the First United Methodist Church on Van Buren and Federal Highway. This is the Parkview Hotel, that same building you just saw. Relatively did very well, I will say. And some buildings were flattened. It was very indiscriminate. There was probably tornadoes. You hear about that there are a lot of tornadoes and hurricanes, and that was probably what happened here. But notice the native vegetation. The Dade County slash pines did just fine. This is an example of bad construction, wood wall there. Look at all these pines. That's all that was in South Florida in 1926. There wasn't all this exotic vegetation. That's the South Broward High School in Dania, which became Dania Elementary. That's the First United Methodist Church next to it. More damage. So, removing all the native vegetation and putting all these exotics also has created a problem for future storms, because a lot of them aren't wind resistant and they topple over and fall onto your house, unfortunately. During the hurricane of 1926, there was construction barges that Joseph Young used, and one of them was a bridge on Johnson to get to the beach, because before Hollywood Boulevard Bridge was built, he used a barge across the Intercoastal Canal. So 3 barges in total washed up during this storm, and one of them made it almost to Federal Highway. Once again, because there was no buildings or trees really to block the way as they started floating up and the tide rose. So we have some personal oral histories that I want to share with you, because we we have quite a rich treasure trove of oral histories in the history of Hollywood Historical Society. And I just picked a few just so you can get an idea of what people went through during the storm. And I'm going to start with the funeral home, and it begins with across Federal Highway, an outside center stairway began to tear apart of the two-story Philbrook funeral parlor. Later, they found out that Mrs. Griffin was upstairs in the display room with her two children, Anderson said. During the first part of the hurricane, she put her kids in coffins to protect them. When the building started to break up, she realized they might suffocate. So she tried to get them out by lowering them on bed sheets to the ground. She literally wrapped her kids up, tied them up to a bed sheet, and was lowering them to the ground. And the gusts were blowing the first youngster around the corners of the building like a toy. When three construction workers crawled over there, the wind picked them up and rolled them over and over, but they made it to the building, caught the first child. Mrs. Griffin lowered the second one on a sheet, and then she shimmied down to the ground herself. What a woman. I mean, that's what you had to do. As a kid myself, I'll never forget the men brought Mrs. Griffin into our house. Her clothes were literally ripped off of her body. Mother opened her closet. Everything was sopping wet, but she loaned Mrs. Griffin a brown linen dress to put on. We didn't see her again for 2 days. When she came back for her children, she wasn't wearing that brown dress. It was wrapped in some newspapers with quite a few blood stains. We found out later that she had been picking up bodies and getting back into the funeral business. I've never seen her since. When the wind suddenly subsided Saturday afternoon, Tony Mickelson was one of the first people out looking for injured survivors. Dr. James Hartley left his home on Monroe Street, where his family had huddled under tables in the living room to administer medical treatment, as did Jim Breeding. These are all very prominent names of Hollywood's history, from His Rec Pharmacy in the Central Arcade. Before the new but de-roofed and flat-tired Rickenbacker touring car was commandeered to transport corpses, Bill Osment witnessed frenzied survivors looting hams, cheeses, and anything else they could carry from a wrecked grocery at 19th and Tayler. Osment also counted 50 bodies laid out at Hollywood Central School and another morgue set up by J.B. Fannin Funeral Home at the de-roofed Young Company Administration building on Hollywood Boulevard. Buck Johnson's Cadillac also became a hearse. After he drove to Roberta and Mrs. Brown's to the Parkview Hotel, they were waiting in line to register when plaster fell from the ceiling and killed an elderly man. He was carried to a room where Dr. McClory was pronouncing dead people. Women and babies were in one room, and children who couldn't find their parents were in another. The crying and groaning was terrible. Injured were taken to the Great Southern and Poinciana hotels and the Maryland apartment. Mrs. Minnie Kingston's house on Dixie Highway and E.H. Whitten's Villa Hermosa. 3 men carried Mrs. Whitson through flooded streets after the storm to her own small but luxurious hotel, which was also used as shelter after the storm. And this was a very interesting story as well. This woman was nearing pregnancy. So this woman was nearing terminal in pregnancy, and as they struggled in the raging storm, labor pains became too great to continue, and they crawled into a new septic tank at Ralph Thompson's plant a short distance from their home. The baby girl was born in the tank with only the young father to assist. As soon as possible after the wind died sufficiently, mother and baby were taken to the Great Southern Hospital, and both were fine after that. And this followed one of the most unusual stories in the hurricane. The hotel was supposed to be a setting for a formal wedding the second day after the hurricane. The bridegroom was resplendent in full dress uniform of a Canadian Army officer. The bride, who was superstitious, vetoed the suggestion the wedding be postponed. She came from an eastern state. She wore a formal gown of white satin, white chapel veil length, and the deep carpeting of the great lounge squished water underfoot as the bridal march played on a very damp piano by Arnold Johnson, garbed in a bathing suit. So there was some humor after this. During the lull, this is what I talked about early, Tony Mickelson, who was astonished to discover that knee-deep water covering the downtown was in fact from the sea. He waited for home in the little ranches west of the FEC Railroad. The wind caught him attempting to cross the tracks at Polk Street and rolled him over and over 3 to 4 times. When he reached a row of cottages in the 2300 block, he saw that his own house had hurtled, which means it got lifted in the air and went over a parked car without denting it and landed 85 feet away, causing 1 casualty. So his entire house got picked up and moved 85 feet away. This is a funny story about one of the barges that floated up. So there was a night watchman named Arthur Carthon who was on duty at the Hollywood Country Club to prevent theft of equipment. Apparently, we had thieves back in 1926. Can you imagine? Of the Hollywood Country Club to prevent theft of the equipment from a paving project. As water rose around his car, Carthon climbed on a cement mixer. He prayed for salvation, and a 70-foot steel barge lodged against his truck while he was praying. And he said, when I saw that thing coming, Arthur told his cronies the rest of his life, I jumped on, went through an open hatch, and stayed below until it stopped. I stuck my head out of the hatch then and saw a big frog. And he said, every time that frog jumped, it would be blown back 5 feet. He said he stayed put until the wind stopped blowing that frog around, got out, brushed himself off, and said, thank you, Lord, you sent me transportation, or I would have never made it. When the crest reached the windowsill of Bud Milliken's home at 1705 McKinley, that's pretty high for 1705 because that's very close to Federal Highway. Edith May and her husband floundered from house to house towards Federal. Bud was in his underwear, Edith May in a raincoat over her nightgown. As they crawled on their hands and knees towards a cement block garage, they wedged into a toilet crammed with 17 people. The water rose waist high, and the men took turns standing on each other's shoulders, holding down the roof with their bare hands as the rest of the garage collapsed around their refuge. Edith May remembers a cement mixer outside the toilet with the toilet window and said, if the water gets any higher on that truck, she said, I've made up my mind to get out of here before we drowned like rats. And G.W. Rydell Hoover's house on Harrison Street shuddered in the shrieking wind. Oscar was watching the rafters when their roof completely vanished. He carried his ailing mother while his father dragged 2 younger sisters to an outdoor toilet. So apparently outdoor toilets were quite the refuge back then. So these stories just go on and on. I just took a few so you could kind of get an idea what happened to people who were experiencing these things. A lot of people didn't know it was coming. Like I said, the only way that word got out was a radio. And if you didn't happen to have a radio, you had to rely on somebody running around saying a hurricane was coming, which a lot of people didn't do. It was Saturday night. They were out. So people were sleeping when this thing happened. Some people were actually didn't even know what was going on. So here's a picture of one of the barges that I spoke about. And as you can see, there's not a lot in the background. This is at 1025 Tayler Street. This house is still here and pretty much looks this way, which I find pretty amusing that it's still there like that. And this is the second barge. And this is the Hollywood Beach Hotel. This is an alleyway. This building is actually still here. And this is Joseph Young's home, which, as you can see, did pretty darn good. And T.D. Ellis, a prominent young attorney at the time who was a bachelor, jumped on one of the other barges with some other people as their apartment house was being flooded on Hollywood Boulevard and rode that thing all the way. They were trying to get to the Parkview Hotel when they saw the barge floating by, and they said, well, let's just get on this thing. And they got on that, and it stopped right before the Parkview Hotel. So they were actually lucky, and they actually were fearful too, because it was so pitch black. They weren't sure if that barge was going out to sea, and what a terror that would have been. There was no way of knowing really where it was going to go. So these barges actually helped people escape the floodwaters. And here's a picture of that church before the storm. And as you can see, it's a concrete building, relatively well built. And this is what happened to it after. So some buildings that were relatively well built collapsed and others that didn't. But I will tell you the ones that did very well were buildings built by Joseph Young and Rubish and Hunter architecture firm, which was a prominent architecture firm that he chose to develop and design, not develop, but design the buildings for Hollywood. And they were from Indianapolis. I'm not sure what they were doing right, not being from South Florida or any experience with wind loads or anything like that, but all of their buildings were standing after this hurricane, which is a testament to their building techniques at the time. This is what the Hollywood Beach Hotel looked like after the storm. Every single window, shopping promenade on the ground floor was gone. This is seaweed, and there was sand, according to my next door neighbor who died at 101 and was here. He helped his father with donkeys and carts scooping the sand out of this building, which had got piled up to the second floor. So they must have cleared out an area for that bride to have her wedding. But you can see it's relatively unscathed, and a lot of some of the windows have been blown out, but it did just fine. And there's the sand piled up. This is after they got the sand out of the building. And believe it or not, this thing opened for the winter season. The storm hit in September. It opened in the winter, like probably December or January, which is amazing. This house lost its second story. This is 16th and Johnston, and this is the house today. It's amazing. Some of these houses are still with us that went through this storm. This is Joseph Young's house, Rubish and Hunter again, and you can see basically awnings are missing. A lot of the windows. This house has almost all of its original windows, which blew me away. And you can tell an original window, it has lead in it, and it's a wavy glass appearance. So it's remarkable that that is still there. This is a house in the lakes shortly after the storm. The tide had not receded, and this was all surrounded by water. I'm not sure where this building is, but it is in the lakes, and it's probably gone at this point. This is the post office, complete wreckage. This is Hollywood Boulevard after the storm, and here is the Hollywood Beach Hotel. I'm gonna ask everybody to, at the end of this lecture, tell me what is wrong with this picture. So everybody take a good look at this picture. This is like a little quiz for everybody's audience participation. What is wrong with this picture? Here's Joseph Young's house. This is the beach. That's the Hollywood Beach Hotel. Take a mental picture. And then we're gonna get to that at the end. This is Morningstar Jewelers. This building is still with us today and houses the Morningstar Jewelry Store. And it was the Joseph Young Administration Building, and it was a second floor, but obviously the second floor was made out of flimsy 2x4s and was not built to withstand what we had coming. This is the Hippodrome. Hippodrome was a gigantic burlesque theater on Federal Highway near Garfield Street, which it was called East Dixie Highway at the time. It wasn't called Federal Highway. And it was a total wreck after the storm. And we actually have a historic marker on a house not far from this building where the owners of that property harvested the lumber from this wreck and built their home. And it's made out of salvaged lumber from this building, and it's called the Jones home. And unfortunately, Mike Jones, who actually lived there, actually just passed away recently, and we were sad to hear that he passed away. He was a lover of history and then asked that donations be made to the Historical Society in lieu of flowers, which we really loved him for that. This is the Great Southern Hotel. It became a hospital. And look, basically, I mean, some of the canvas awnings are still on this building. Granted, this is on the west side, but the fact that they're even there, and the Great Southern has just been, an exact duplicate has been rebuilt, and this awning, this classic awning, is now present. Although it's not the original structure, we are happy that they actually reproduced it exactly as it was, with these columns and these spires on the decorated ornamentation around the windows. It's all there now for everybody to enjoy, like it was never gone. And it was gone temporarily, unfortunately. This is the Joseph Young Bus Company garage, and you can see it was a total wreck. Look at all the buses, they're completely destroyed. This is a very interesting picture because this wooden structure is a sales pavilion that used to be on the beach, and it was blown into North Lake. This is North Lake, and this is the intact. These were like Wizard of Oz houses. They got picked up and apparently were built very well, but weren't fastened to their foundation. So when the wind lifted them up, they stayed together. Hence Tony Mickelson's house was intact. And it's the same with this building. They didn't fall apart, but the wind picked them up and moved them. This is the Villa Homosa. This is E.F. Whitson's hotel, which also is a Rubish and Hunter design, which became a house for homeless and refugees. And this building, the Villa Hermosa, Red Cross went there as well, fed almost 500 people a day after the storm. It is remarkable how some people really pitched in and helped the recovery effort. This is another building that was damaged. These are rows of houses in Liberia. Liberia is a very special Black community that was obviously segregated in 1926. A lot of the Black pioneers in Liberia that's in Hollywood were from Miami Coconut Grove. And a lot of those residents were from the Bahamas, and they built things there that knew how to withstand a storm. And you can see a lot of their wooden cottages did not get blown off their foundations, and they are intact. And this is Dade County pine, which is a very, very strong wood. It's the native timber that they use to build structures. And it's a testament to the knowledge that they had of how to build these little wooden cottages that they lived in. Unfortunately, a lot of them are gone. This is the Tangerine Tea Room that we saw the baby parade. This is the Broadwalk. This is somebody's car. This thing was a complete wreck and was demolished, unfortunately. This home is at 902 Hollywood Boulevard, completely intact. Now, the water in the lakes was waist high. It was about 4 feet high. So a lot of these homes were completely flooded. This element here is a gigantic fountain wall. I always thought this was something built way after this home, And I was happy to see this picture that it's actually original to the home. The home looks like that today, as a matter of fact. This is a shot of downtown Hollywood. Here's the administration building, which became a morgue. Later, when Hollywood Inc. was formed, they took up residence here. There was actually Piggly Wiggly here. This is actually the site of Anniversary Park, if you want to know where this is. And here's the Central Arcade and the Morse Arcade and the Hollywood Publishing Company. The train station, again, Rubish and Hunter, completely intact. Great Southern was Martin Luther Hampton, by the way. I don't know if I said it was Rubish. It really wasn't. Look at this Dade County pine. These Dade County pines, they need to bring them back. There's one that got felled here, but my goodness, we need to start repopulating our native vegetation. Here's another shot of the bank. This building here with the steel dome was considered to be Hollywood City Hall, and it was too badly damaged. And the ultimate decision was that Hollywood City Hall went to the second circle. And I've said this before, I'm going to say it again because maybe not everybody's heard it. Hollywood was a joke on Ripley's Believe It or Not, because it was that circle, what, by the way, was so far west, there wasn't anything there but pine trees. And our country club was in downtown. So the joke was Hollywood was the only city where their city hall was in the country and their country club was in the city, which was true. So that everybody always got a chuckle out of that. More shots of the wreckage in downtown. This is the Hollywood Beach Country Club building. Martin Luther Hampton, architect, obviously another good architect, built very well. And the Flora Apartments. This building is still here and still serving as an apartment building, oddly enough. And it looks just like that, except it's got new windows. Unfortunately, this building was demolished and we are building a new one in this location. The city built a new clubhouse in the middle of the golf course, and we're moving it back to this location, which is 17th and Polk, which is right next to downtown, which is where it should have been always. They should have never moved it to the middle of the golf course. This is an example of poor construction. You can see the thin wood in the roof line here, and this is a flimsy cardboard paper thin exterior wall, and this is on the beach. I don't even know why this wall even stood. So a lot of people built houses so fast because the building boom, there was such a frenzy that they just slapped them up as fast as they could and did not take any thought into construction techniques. But some people did, obviously, as we see. This is another picture of that barge. And I want everybody to take a mental picture and tell me what this building is at the end of the lecture, if you could. So there's your 2 mystery questions. And all the smoke that you see, they're burning the garbage. There was no waste pro, there was no garbage collection. These things were, you had to take matters in your own hand and just get rid of your garbage yourself. This is a very interesting shot because Joseph Young wanted to build his house on the beach, another home, and he was going to develop all of Westlake. This was all going to be dredged just like North and South Lake, and there was going to be homes, and there was going to be bridges, and it was going to be beautiful and fantastic. And then that obviously never happened, and it's Westlake Preserve, which we're all happy about. But if you look here, you could see there's a body of water here. This was called Duck Lake, and it was called Duck Lake, I'm assuming, because there was ducks in it. But it was, believe it or not, a freshwater lake on the ocean. So Joseph Young was going to build his home here. And if you look, the intercoastal has been straightened out here, and this has been widened here. And as you go north, Sheridan Street's right about here, and the intercoastal stops, goes this way, and there's another inlet. This is the New River Inlet right here, probably between Sheridan Street and Dania Beach Boulevard. It's not our natural coastline. So this all got straightened out. All this got shifted to the west. But after the night, and the reason that it was called the New River, by the way, in case you don't know, is because it did have a shifting inlet. The New River Inlet kept moving around, as coastlines do naturally. The wind, the waves, storms, silt up an inlet, and then a new one gets formed. So there was actually the New River Inlet was in Hollywood at one time. So when they were exploring Florida, they would find these new inlets and call it a new river, and it wasn't a new river. It was the same river. It was just the inlet got moved. A little sidebar. After the 1926 storm, this whole lake completely covered, never to be seen again. So Joseph Young made the right decision in building his home where he did on the Boulevard, because it would have been gone. Just a row of houses. This has nothing to do with the hurricane, but it got in there somehow. And this is that building that was supposed to be City Hall. You can see the park view is here, and this steel structure obviously was too badly damaged. Again, a lot of native pines. Here's a picture of the school before it was damaged. Then that's after the damage. And I keep talking about no warning, and I want to say maybe purposely so. There was discussion in some of the history that I've read about this, that the salesmen that were experiencing this bust of a bubble did not want bad press to add to their woes. They intentionally minimized the threat to people and did not really want to broadcast it on a wide scale level because they knew a storm was out there, but they didn't want to freak people out. So that added to the unawareness of what was about to happen. And then after the storm, they wanted to minimize the damage because they didn't want people to go, oh, I'm not going down there. I'm not. And so the Red Cross was getting very frustrated with the salesmen and the people in South Florida because they needed money for relief efforts. And if you're going to say nothing happened here, they can't get the help they need. So there was a little bit of a clash after this storm between the Red Cross and the people that were trying to help. Salvation Army was one of the first ones here, and the Red Cross and many others, martial law. I mean, you name it. It all, after this hurricane, all this stuff happened. So the biggest thing that happened that altered our history, 800 people left immediately. And then many thousands left later, including Dania and Hallandale. So this is part of the altering the course of Hollywood's history. Had this storm not hit, Dania and Hallandale would have stayed in the fold, so to speak. In 1925, they were so excited about what was going on in Hallandale. Dania was a city, Hallandale was not, and they incorporated in 1904 when it was still Dade County. Dania was a city in Dade County. And in 1925, they realized Joseph Young is building an incredible city and they want in on the action, and they voted to be annexed by the city of Hollywood. Hallandale, which wasn't a city, said, well, we'll go too. So at one time, the coastline of Hollywood went from Hallandale to Port Everglades, which, by the way, 80% of Port Everglades is in the city of Hollywood. A lot of people don't know that. And guess what else? The other city that wanted to be part of Hollywood until this hurricane hit, Golden Beach. Golden Beach was considering moving into Hollywood as well. Had this storm not hit, we would have been the biggest dog in Broward County. We would have been a huge city. But things happen, and that did not transpire. This is what I talk about, history repeating itself. So here you have a lesson that was learned, and there was flimsy building practices. Right after the hurricane, Miami seeks wind-resistant type of houses. What do we have during Andrew? Country Walk, shoddy construction. And I got news for everybody. Country Walk subdivisions are all over Broward County. I can't tell you how many homes that are built the exact same way as Country Walk. These are plywood homes that they stuccoed over, and they have gigantic plywood gables that aren't braced and cannot take a category 4 or 5 hit. This history will repeat itself again, unfortunately, because I think we learned right after the hurricane, but then obviously so many years went by and corruption worms its way into city halls that practices were dropped, inspectors were paid off, hurricane straps aren't present. So I am very fearful that when this does happen again, because it's not a matter of if, it's really a matter of when, and we almost got it during Dorian, that we are going to see a similar situation. And this blew me away also. This is the category 4 and 5 strikes that have hit South Florida since 1918. And this is where Hollywood is. And you can see we have not been hit from the ocean with the eye wall since 1926, because obviously there was some sort of lull in Hollywood. Hurricane King is the closest, but Hurricane King, and this is what the difference, these hurricanes come in all shapes and sizes. They're like people. So Hurricane King was a tiny storm with a small eye and not a low pressure and a fast mover. So it came in and went out really quick. Hollywood was on the south side of King. By the way, King was the only eye wall category 4 that has ever struck Fort Lauderdale. So they got their first one in I think it was 1950 or 1947. Hollywood has not. So to say are overdue is an understatement. And I find it odd that it's 2022. And in 1922, we were undergoing this crazy building boom, and we're kind of right back to where we were in 2022. But adding to the misery, so to speak, is the factor of sea level rise. It has risen quite a bit since 1926. And the tall buildings that are present in Brickell and Sunny Isles that are on the beach that nobody knows if they can take that kind of pounding. What will happen to these gigantic, tall? I heard that they're going to build a 100-story building in Brickell. I'm not sure anybody wants to be on the 100th floor with 150-mile-an-hour winds coming at you. But I do want to end on a little bit of a bright note, because during the 26th, after the 26th storm, there was two orchestras in Hollywood. One was Arnold Johnson. These were very famous orchestra bands, by the way, that Joseph Young hired to entertain residents and tourists. And Caesar Lamanca, after the storm, paraded up and down Hollywood Boulevard and the hospitals to try to lift people's spirits. And the one song that they played the most is "The World is Waiting for a Sunrise." So I have a little recording of that so you can hear what that sound, what the people heard after the 1926 storm. I feel better already. I don't know about you. So that is the end of this kind of scary presentation. So I'm going to stop the share and take any questions. We can unmute everybody if the host would, or just unmute yourselves if you have a question. Anybody has a question, I'll be happy to answer it if I can.
Clive,
Yes.
Victor. Clive, I was the best speaker until you today.
Oh, stop it, Victor.
This is the best presentation we had. And I mean it sincerely.
Well, thank you, Victor. Thank you very much.
How did they communicate? By telegraph?
It was telegraphed when the warning finally got issued at 11 p.m. It was radio. So they got on the radio, and who had a radio? And a lot of people didn't have a radio. So there was really no way to get the word out.
Right. And also, Clive, and I'll stop talking in less than a minute. You have to put this in writing. You have to give this to our future generations. This was a tremendous education for us, and I appreciate it very much. We all do. And our friends of the library and the Hollywood Historical Society, thank you. And if I can make just two other little comments. T.D. Ellis, who was on the barge, according to the book, The History of Hollywood, his hair went completely white, kind of like mine, but that was not true. And one of the houses you were talking about on South Lake is directly behind mine.
Oh, fantastic.
All right. Thank you, Clive.
Clive, thank you, Victor. And it's good to see you again, Victor. Clive, I was blown away.
Literally.
It was fabulous.
Yeah, right.
There was a comment earlier when you were talking about the Philbrick House. Was that the Art and Cultural Center? It was a question. Was that the Art and Cultural Center now?
Was that one of my, is he answering the question of what this building is?
No, they're asking whether that is now the Art and Cultural Center.
No, that was the Johnson Foster Funeral Home.
Okay.
This particular funeral home was apparently on Federal Highway, where the lady put her babies out in the storm.
That was Wadlington, Brown, and Cooper.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Susan May said to everyone that this was just a fantastic presentation. You're getting a lot of wonderful comments on the chat line. The images really made it come to life, and that is so true. The images brought history, history. This was a living history, and I do agree with Victor. There has to be documentation from this. Are there any other comments or questions for Clive?
Lynn Smith. Hello, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yep.
Well, Clive, you and I must be on the same wavelength, and we talked the other day about that. On May 3rd, Ryan Norcross is coming to Hollywood to be our guest speaker at Arts Park. And I didn't realize that Clive had this presentation. And I don't think he realized that I was doing Brian Norcross, but I really feel the same way Clive does. I think we're all waiting for something. We've been really lucky. And Mr. Norcross is going to come and talk about some really interesting things. He's going to be May 3rd at Arts Park at 7 o'clock. So if you guys would like to see somebody who is really probably one of the foremost meteorologists who has been through more hurricanes than most. And we're really anxious to hear him. And he asked, I sent him the information for the Historical Society, and he asked, he wasn't able to come today, but Clive is going to set this presentation up on, I guess, on your website. And he
Our
asked,
YouTube, it'll be available on our YouTube page in a day or two.
yeah, and he's going to watch it because I think that the Historical Society has information that he would like to gather, because he is a historian too about this. But I think that Clive, you and I are trying to tell some story, and everybody needs to pay attention, because none of us are really, we just keep thinking we're going to get lucky, that it's going to go someplace else. And I've been thinking about having him come to talk to us for a very long time. And I thought that he would be important to tell us some history. So if any of you have any questions for him, it's dprpca.org is our website. Please feel free to send them to me and I will forward them to him. And Clive, this was a wonderful, scary presentation, but hurricanes, I'm 5 generations, and my family's lived through hurricanes for generations, and they're never fun. And no matter what it is, and no matter how you're prepared, I just think it's a matter of whether you're lucky or not. That's what it comes down to. Because there's no way you can really prepare for what's going to hit where.
Right. Does anybody else have another question?
It was asked whether we can put that information in the chat. So that website, that DPRCA, would you please put that in the chat?
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
that would be great.
Brian Norcross is a friend of mine. He might not remember me, but I knew him 20 years ago. And can I just give one little comment, Clive? I'm sorry. When Hurricane Wilma came and blew off my roof 16 or 17 years ago, and we all slept in the same bed together, my wife, my 4 kids, and me, and I saw my roof falling into my pool, I was really hoping it was my neighbor's roof. But it was
That's okay.
mine.
That's okay. Does anybody else have any other questions?
We answer the Hollywood.
It's in the chat, the answer.
Oh, it's already done?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Is the answer in the chat?
Yes,
The answer. Okay, does anybody?
Is it that the picture is reversed?
No.
Oh, very
Yes.
good, Fred.
yes,
Very good.
yes.
The picture, it took me a while. I'm like, what is wrong with this picture? Apparently the
best.
negative was developed backwards and the young house was on the wrong side of the street.
I saw
Yes,
that.
yes.
I did see that.
And then the other building, does anybody know what that other building was?
Yes,
What?
I went to see the houses on sale.
No, the other building. I said, can anybody tell me what this
Ah.
other building is?
I thought it was the 15th and 111.
The one on South Lake was across the water from me.
Let me go back to it.
It's not 122 North 15th Avenue.
Can everybody see the slides again?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to that building.
So
Uh-oh, wait a minute, I missed it. Hold on. Un momento, por favor, señores.
so the what is wrong is that the picture was the other way around.
The
Yes.
wrong
Oh,
side
I
is-
just want to see how good you are at identifying buildings that maybe look a little bit different today. That one, what house is that?
That's the
Yeah.
Young House.
No?
No,
No.
122 North 15th Avenue.
All right, nobody knows. I'm gonna tell you, you're gonna die. It's the Kagi Mansion. It's Joseph Young's top salesman. He won a
wow.
that is the Art and Cultural Center today.
You're right.
What a
I
beautiful
didn't know
house,
that.
huh? Isn't that a beautiful house?
Wow.
And if you notice, if you ever go to a function there, and you walk into that big space where the art is, here's the fountain. The fountain is right here, outside the house. Now this is inside the room.
Let's go see that.
That fountain is inside the room, and this is all the big meeting space over here. This fountain right here, this fountain.
Kiva.
And my
So-
office is over to the right, the home tower building.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, all right, so I guess that's it. Nobody else has any other questions? Great.
Great
Thank you,
job.
Clive. Thank you for allowing me to host you.
Great job as usual.
Thank you, everybody. I'm gonna go out and go to
Bye.
the beach now, and since there's
Have
no
fun.
hurricane coming.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.